In the spring of 1946, the quiet lover lanes of Texarkana became a hunting ground for young couples looking for a moment of privacy. The flash of a light in the darkness was the first sign that their night was about to take a terrifying turn. They were being watched by a hooded figure who would become known as the Phantom. Over 10 terrifying weeks, this sadistic killer targeted young people, leaving behind a legacy of fear and unsolved cases that baffle experts to this day. Who was the man behind the mask, and what became of the Phantom of Texarkana? The year was 1946. America was breathing a collective sigh of relief. World War II was over, and a wave of optimism was washing over the nation. Soldiers were coming home, families were reuniting, and the country was looking forward to an era of peace and prosperity. In the bustling bi-state town of Texarkana, which uniquely straddles the border of Texas and Arkansas, this post-war hope was palpable. The streets were busy, the economy was humming, and for the young people of the town, life was brimming with possibility. In an era before drive-in theaters were everywhere, and before the social freedoms of later decades, privacy for a young couple was a precious commodity. It was often found in the quiet, unlit back roads that crisscrossed the piney woods around the city. These were the lovers' lanes, secluded spots where sweethearts could park, listen to the radio, and share a few moments alone. Away from the prying eyes of parents and neighbors, they were seen as innocent, idyllic sanctuaries. But in the spring of 1946, that perception was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. A shadow was falling over Texarkana, a predator who would turn these havens of romance into hunting grounds, staining the town's idyllic image with blood and terror that would last for generations. The terror began on the night of Friday, February the 22nd, 1946. Jimmy Hollis, a 25-year-old man, and his 19-year-old girlfriend, Mary Jane Lowry, had just seen a movie and were looking for a place to talk. They drove his car down a secluded stretch of road outside the Texarkana city limits that was often used as a lover's lane. They parked, and the whole world around them felt quiet and dark. It was around midnight. After only a few minutes, a bright light slashed through the darkness, shining directly into their car window. A tall figure stood by the driver's side door. His face was hidden by a crude white mask, like a pillowcase or a burlap sack, with holes cut out for his eyes. In one hand, he held the flashlight, in the other, a pistol. The man's voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. As he gave his first command, he told Jimmy, "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so do what I say." He ordered the terrified couple out of the car and then told Jimmy Hollis to take off his pants. Before Jimmy could fully process the bizarre command, the attacker struck. He raised the pistol and brought it down on Jimmy's head with sickening force. Not once, but repeatedly. The man bludgeoned Jimmy, fracturing his skull in multiple places. With Jimmy lying motionless on the ground, the attacker turned his attention to Mary Jean. He told her to run, and she scrambled away in sheer terror. But her attacker easily caught up with her and subjected her to a brutal sexual assault. The horrific ordeal was only interrupted by the sudden appearance of headlights from an approaching car, which spooked the masked man. He fled into the darkness, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. Mary Jean Lowry, battered but still alive, ran half a mile to the nearest farmhouse and frantically called the police. Miraculously, Jimmy Hollis regained consciousness and flagged down a passing motorist. Both were rushed to the hospital with severe injuries. Bowie County Sheriff Bill Presley and his deputies were on the scene within 30 minutes, but the assailant was long gone. This was the first time the Phantom would strike, and the only time his victims would survive to give a description. They told police Their attacker was a tall man, about 6 feet, wearing a white mask, but their accounts of his race were conflicting. Jimmy Hollis believed he was a young, dark-tanned white man, while Mary Jean Lowry thought he was a light-skinned African-American. This discrepancy would plague the investigation at the very beginning. In the immediate aftermath, law enforcement treated the brutal assault as an isolated, vicious crime. Some officers even theorized that Hollis and Lowry knew their attacker and were protecting him, a notion that hampered the early investigation. They couldn't have known this wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a prelude. The Phantom had made his first move, and he had left his victims alive to tell the tale. It was a warning, but one that Texarkana had not yet learned to heed. For a month, an uneasy quiet settled over Texarkana. The attack on Hollis and Lowry was a shocking story, but life moved on. Then, almost exactly 1 month later, the shadow returned. This time, he wouldn't be interrupted. On the morning of Sunday, March the 24th, 1946, a passing motorist on a secluded back road in Bowie County noticed a car parked in a thicket. Inside the 1941 Oldsmobile, he made a grim discovery: the bodies of 29-year-old Richard Lennar Griffin and his 17-year-old girlfriend, Polly Ann Moore. Richard was a Navy veteran of World War II, a survivor of global conflict, only to meet his end on a quiet road in his hometown. Polly Ann was a vibrant young woman who had been dating him for just 6 weeks. The crime scene was chilling. Richard Griffin was found slumped between the front seats, his hands crossed and his pockets turned inside out. Polly Ann Moore was sprawled in the back seat, face down. Both had been shot execution style, once in the back of the head. The weapon used was a .32 caliber handgun. Investigators, including Sheriff Bill Presley, quickly realized the scene wasn't what it seemed. A large patch of blood on the ground near the car, aligned with blood on the running board, told a different story. It appeared Richard and Polly Ann had been killed outside the vehicle, and their bodies were then carefully placed back inside. The killer had taken the time to stage the scene. The only significant piece of evidence left behind was a single .32 caliber cartridge casing. With this brutal double homicide, the atmosphere in Texarkana shifted dramatically. This was no longer an isolated assault. It was something far more sinister. The local newspaper, the Texarkana Gazette, began covering the story with urgency, and soon a name for the killer emerged from their pages: the Phantom Killer. It was a perfect name. It captured the assailant's terrifying ability to appear out of nowhere, commit his horrific acts, and then vanish without a trace, like a ghost in the moonlight. The police now faced a terrifying reality. They had a double murder on their hands, and one who was growing bolder. They started connecting the dots back to the Hollis-Lowry attack. The similarities were undeniable. A young couple, a secluded lover's lane, a nighttime attack. The key difference was the escalation. A vicious assault had turned into cold-blooded murder. Fear, once a whisper, began to grow into a roar that spread through every corner of the bi-state town. The Phantom had claimed his first victims, and the town was about to learn that he was not only just beginning. The fear simmering in Texarkana was about to boil over. The Phantom Killer, as he was known, seemed to have a terrifying pattern. He struck on weekends, targeting young couples in the dark. The name Moonlight Murders began to circulate, a chilling moniker for the horror that was unfolding, even though the attacks didn't always line up with the full moon. As spring bloomed, so did the terror. 3 weeks after the first murders, the Phantom would strike again, this time with a level of brutality that would cement his legacy as one of America's most fearsome serial killers. The night of Saturday, April 13th, stretched into the early morning of Sunday, April 14th. 15-year-old Betty Jo Booker was a talented musician, a proud member of her high school band. That night, she played her alto saxophone at the VFW club. Around 1:30 a.m., her good friend, 16-year-old Paul Martin, picked her up. They were last seen driving toward Spring Lake Park, a large recreational area that, after dark, became another one of Texarkana's lovers' lanes. What happened next is a gruesome picture pieced together from police reports. Paul Martin's body was found first around 6:30 a.m. by a search party of family and friends. He was lying on the side of a road, riddled with bullets. He had been shot 4 times. A wider search party combed the park for any sign of Betty Jo. Hours later, around noon, her body was discovered nearly 2 miles away from Paul's, hidden behind a tree. She'd been shot twice. The crime scene told a story of horrific violence. The distance between the bodies and the nature of their wounds pointed to a brutal attack that went far beyond a simple execution. This was the work of a killer who seemed to revel in the act of terror itself. The killer had even taken Betty Jo's saxophone, which was later found discarded in its case nearby. Paul Martin's car was found abandoned about 3 miles from where his body lay. The keys still in the ignition. Ballistic test delivered the news everyone feared. The evidence strongly indicated that the same .32 caliber pistol was used in his attack as the murders of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore. There was no longer any doubt. A serial killer, a sex maniac, as the press called him, was methodically hunting the youth of Texarkana. The news, this third attack, with its horrifying details and the young age of the victims, plunged the city into a full-blown panic. The Phantom wasn't just a murderer. He was a monster who seemed to be escalating his violence with each attack. The spring of 1946 was no longer a season of hope in Texarkana. It was a season of the Phantom. With the discovery of the bodies of Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker, Texarkana transformed. The post-war optimism that defined the town just weeks earlier was replaced by a thick, palpable cloud of fear. The city was under siege, not by a foreign army, but by a single, shadowy figure. The community was gripped by paranoia that made every shadow a potential threat. The town, in a very real sense, began to dread sundown. As darkness fell, life in Texarkana ground to a halt. Businesses shuttered their doors at dusk. Parents imposed ironclad curfews. The lovers' lanes, once symbols of youth romance, were now utterly deserted. Hardware stores sold out of guns, ammunition, and locks as people armed themselves, turning their homes into fortresses against the monster who walked among them. The overwhelmed local police departments called for reinforcements. The Arkansas State Police and the FBI brought in to assist, but the most dramatic arrival was that of the Texas Rangers. Leading the charge was the legendary Captain Manuel Lone Wolf Gonzalez, a figure straight out of the Old West. He was a tough, no-nonsense lawman with a reputation for always getting his man. He arrived in Texarkana with a confident swagger, assuring the terrified public that the killer would be brought to justice. He famously taunted the Phantom in the newspaper, daring him to show himself. The law enforcement presence was immense. Officers from both states patrolled the back roads. Roadblocks were established on roads leading in and out of the city. Some armed youths even tried to bait the killers themselves, a practice officials quickly condemned as dangerous. The pressure on law enforcement was intense. The entire nation was watching, waiting for a break in the case. But as the days turned into weeks, the Phantom remained silent, and the town held its breath, wondering when and where the hooded killer would strike next. Just when everyone thought they understood the Phantom's brutal script, young couples, on weekends, and secluded lovers' lanes, the killer rewrote the rules. The next attack would prove that no one was safe, not even in their own home. 3 weeks had passed since the last murders. The attack came on a Friday night, May the 3rd, 1946. This time, the victims weren't teenagers in a park camp. They were a middle-aged couple, Virgil and Katie Starks, in their isolated farmhouse in Miller County, Arkansas, about 10 miles from Texarkana. Virgil Starks was at home, sitting in his armchair reading the newspaper. The night was quiet, and then suddenly the tranquility was shattered by the sound of breaking glass and 2 deafening gunshots. An attacker standing outside had fired directly through the closed window, striking Virgil twice in the back of the head. He died almost instantly. His wife, Katie, heard the shots and ran to the telephone to call for help. The killer fired again from the same window, and 2 bullets struck her in the face, shattering her jaw. Despite the excruciating pain, an incredible survival instinct took over. Katie Starks managed to flee into the darkness, running barefoot to a neighbor's house for help. She survived, though her life was forever changed. When Sheriff W.E. Davis of Miller County arrived, they found Virgil Starks dead in his chair and blood trails marking Katie's desperate escape. Investigators found a puzzling piece of evidence. The weapon used was a .22 caliber pistol, not the .32 caliber from the previous murders. This immediately raised questions. Was this a copycat? And many law enforcement, including the Texas Rangers, believed it was indeed the work of the Phantom, but there was never a clear consensus. The shift in his method was terrifying. He was no longer just a lover's lane killer. He was now a home invader. The psychological impact was devastating. If a person wasn't safe in their own home, where could they be? This attack on the Starks farmhouse would be the last murder commonly attributed to the Phantom Killer. After 10 weeks of terror, 4 attacks, 5 people murdered, and 3 seriously wounded, the violence stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The killing stopped, but the fear lingered, slowly turning into a gnawing, unanswered question. Who was the Phantom? The massive manhunt continued, and investigators began to focus on one man, a career criminal who would become prime suspect. His name was Ewell Sweeney. Sweeney was a 29-year-old small-time crook with a long rap sheet for car theft and counterfeiting. The connection was made by an Arkansas State Police trooper, Max Thackett, who noticed that a car was reported stolen before each of the Phantom's attacks. This trail of stolen cars led directly to Sweeney. Sweeney and his wife, Peggy, were arrested in July 1946 on car theft charges. The case against him for the murders began to solidify when Peggy started talking, allegedly providing information that only someone at the scenes could have known. It seemed like the break investigators were praying for. However, the case against Sweeney was built on shaky ground. Peggy was an unreliable witness who repeatedly changed her story. Crucially, under the law at the time, a wife could not be forced to testify against her husband. Without her testimony in court, the prosecution's case was largely circumstantial. While some stories claim police found a shirt with a laundry mark that read Stark, there was no definitive physical evidence to tie him to the crimes. Sweeney never confessed. Ultimately, prosecutors felt they couldn't secure a murder conviction. Instead, Sweeney was convicted as a habitual offender for car theft and sentenced to life in prison. He was released in 1973 and died in 1994, never having been charged with the murders. Key investigators like Max Thackett and Lone Wolf Gonzalez went to their graves believing Sweeney was the Phantom. While Sweeney remains the most compelling suspect, he wasn't the only one. There were numerous false confessions. One notable confession came from H.B. Tennyson, a college student who took his own life in 1948, leaving behind a note claiming he was the Phantom. However, his confession lacked specific details and was widely dismissed by investigators. The theories have continued to swirl for decades. Was the Phantom a local who knew the back roads intimately? Was he a soldier returning from the war, suffering from severe psychological trauma? Or was the change in weapon during the final attack a signal of a copycat? Theories have continued to swirl for decades. Was the Phantom a local who knew the back roads intimately? Was he a soldier returning from the war, suffering from severe psychological trauma? Or was the change in weapon during the final attack a sign of a copycat? All of these questions remain unanswered. What do you think happened? The theories surrounding the Phantom Killer are as numerous as they are fascinating. We've only scratched the surface of the main suspects. If you have a theory of your own or know of another suspect you find compelling, let us know in the comments below. And if you're finding this dive into one of America's coldest case interesting, be sure to hit that subscribe button and the ring notification bell so you don't miss out on our next investigation. The Spring of Terror in 1946 ended, but the story of the Phantom Killer was far from over. The case officially remains open and unsolved. The Phantom simply vanished, leaving behind a scarred community and a legend that would only grow with time. For generations, the murders became a dark cautionary tale whispered among teenagers in Texarkana, a real-life boogeyman who haunted lovers' lanes. The Phantom's reign of terror might have faded into local history, if not for a low-budget horror film released 3 years later. In 1976, director Charles B. Pierce unleashed The Town That Dreaded Sundown. The film, which claimed to be a true story, was a semi-fictionalized docudrama that recreated the events of 1946 with a gritty, terrifying realism. While it took significant artistic liberties, it successfully captured the raw panic that had paralyzed the city. The movie's iconic poster and chilling tagline, "In 1946, this town was terrorized by a hooded killer. Today, he's still on the loose," cemented the Phantom's image in the public consciousness. The crude burlap sack worn by the killer in the film was an artistic interpretation, but it became the definitive image of the Phantom. For people outside of Texarkana, this film was their introduction to the chilling tale of the Moonlight Murders. This cultural impact is still felt in Texarkana today. The city has a complex relationship with its dark past. While the memory of its victims is honored, the legend of the Phantom has become part of the town's identity. Each year around Halloween, the 1976 film is shown at an outdoor screening in Spring Lake Park, near the area where Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were murdered. It's a tradition that speaks to how communities process tragedy, turning a story of horrific crime into local folklore. For 10 terrifying weeks in the spring of 1946, Texarkana was a town held hostage by a ghost, a hooded figure who emerged from the darkness to attack young couples, leaving 5 people dead and a community paralyzed with fear. The investigation was one of the largest manhunts in Texas history, involving local police, state troopers, the legendary Texas Rangers, and the FBI. Yet, despite a prime suspect and exhaustive search, the killer was never identified, never charged, and never brought to justice. He remains a specter, known only by the name that the press gave him, the Phantom. The lovers' lanes of 1946 have long been paved over, and the generation that lived in fear the setting sun is slowly fading away. But the ghost of the Phantom still lingers, faceless, nameless predator who committed unspeakable acts and then disappeared back into the shadows, leaving behind but a legacy of terror and a question that, after more than 3/4 of a century, will likely never be answered. Who was the Phantom of Texarkana? This is The Dark Room. I'm Madcock. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications.